Les chaos d'Arboten!
Okay. Now, let's see. What is the occult? Now, the occult may have been both common sense and ubiquitous in early modern Europe, but attitudes towards the study of it were often ambiguous. So, by it being so ambiguous, that just means that it was open for interpretation. So that's why it was both common sense and ubiquitous. So, things as simple as common sense could have been as extensive as an occult science, to a certain degree in the way that we're speaking about it, right? So it is difficult to understand its construction in the West without reference to Christian religion and culture. Now, this is something that I've been trying to explain to people a lot. See, we don't have a concept of the occult without reference to Christian religion. So you only know it through the lens of Christianity. But what about outside of Christianity? What about pre-Christianity? You feel what I'm saying? So it's difficult to understand its construction in the West without reference to Christian religion and culture. Even Aleister Crowley, one of the most influential and creative occultists of the modern period, needs to be understood in relation to his Christian context. The explicit rejection of his upbringing within the Plymouth Brethren, the not infrequent references to Christian theological ideas, the enthusiastic embrace of discourses of profanation made available to him by Christian demonology, most notably his identification as Master Theory on the Great Beast 666, taken from the biblical book of Revelation. See, everything about Crowley relates to Christianity because that's his upbringing. And even his profound respect for Christ as an individual who had attained enlightenment. So he viewed Christ as an individual. It doesn't say Jesus, but it says Christ as an individual who had attained enlightenment, are all important for understanding the development of his thought. So when you read Crowley, you understand how a lot of what he even grasped in occult itself stems out of his own upbringing of Christianity. So that's why the beast is 666. It's a Christian reference, because oftentimes that's how we view the occult. And we're going to dig a lot into Aleister Crowley. He's pretty interesting when it comes to the occult. It's the one name, it's the one person that most people know of, have heard of in some way, shape, or form, right? So, in reference to Crowley there, it's vital in understanding just how these things are interpreted. In order to help the reader towards an appreciation of the significance of the subject, perhaps the best place to begin is with the terminology itself, which over the last couple of centuries has become tainted in a way that its sister term, esotericism, has not. Here's another reference. Certainly the latter term of esotericism, which lacks the peculiarly profane significance of the occult in Western popular culture, does not elicit the same emotional response. Okay? This may, I suspect, be an underlying reason for abandoning the terminology of occultism in much academic discourse. So when it comes to discussing in academia, they're not going to use the terminology occultism or occult. It carries too much unhelpful, embarrassing baggage. That is to say, over the last couple of decades, efforts have been made by a number of scholars to establish some degree of terminological coherence and consistency, the result of which has been the adoption of Western esotericism as the general category rather than occultism. So the term occult, of course, simply refers to that which is hidden or concealed. So know that whenever you see Western esotericism or the word esoteric, it's just a nice watered down way I'm just talking about what's still considered the occult. But the occult, the word, the idea of it is tainted. So if you want to, be more academic or try to be more educational or deal with actual, sources and what have you, then you're going to deal with in terms of esotericism. Okay? So however, occult as it is used in this volume, okay, we have already said that has acquired a particular set of meanings, right? Related to gnosis, mystical experience, ancient wisdom, and the secrets of antiquity, derived from the Latin occultus, meaning hidden, concealed, or secret, from celere, to hide. The word occult first appeared in French, occulte, in 1120, in the Soutel de Oxford, and then in other European languages during the 16th century, when we see it beginning to refer to spheres of knowledge beyond everyday understanding, such as the mysterious operations of God. Okay, so it comes on down here. It gives you a little more. It tells you by 1840, well, hence by 1593, English scholar. It gives you a lot of people here, that you can really kind of get into. And we will get into some of them, like it gets down here and tells you that Eliphas Levi in 1856 caused a significant shift in the way occult was viewed. Occultism now represented a particular construction of coherent countercultural wisdom tradition, following a linear pattern rather than a dynamic complex of rhizomatic currents. So instead of it just being random things, it began to be viewed as a more linear construct. Okay, it is a construction that was initially articulated by Protestant and Enlightenment thinkers. Now, if you don't know Protestants, the Protestants are who separated from the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, so they got away from the Roman Catholic Church during the Reformation. And that's how you get all these other groups that started to filter on down, because they were more individualized, because they were all about reading a Bible. So if you got 50 people reading one text, you're going to get 50 different interpretations of it. And that's why a lot of things stimulated out of people who were considered Protestants. Okay, so you got the Protestant enlightened thinkers who sought to establish their own identities over against the opposing other of irrational superstitio. It was then developed by occultists themselves, seeking the intellectual and theological respectability of a specific identity and an ancient tradition. Okay, so this is, as you can see, and we just in the introduction, so we haven't dug deep as of yet, right? So we got a lot to cover, because right now we haven't, like I said, we haven't gotten really into it yet. Okay. The term occultism is often restricted to 19th century developments and succeeding esoteric trajectories, including fields of discourse related to spiritualism, theosophy, magical initiatory orders such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and the New Age. So I'm sure you've heard of all of these before. Western esotericism became the term preferred by academics. That's why we more so see that, and it's more accepted when you're dealing with academics. Always a tie between those who were an intricate part of society and the occult. So take, for example, here, practical interest in astrology, alchemy, and other departments of the occultist tradition ran strong throughout the early modern period among serious thinkers in many disciplines. This concord, however, was not to last, as occult ideas were typically embedded within religious and mythological narratives. It wasn't too long before the relationship between the occult sciences and the new empirical sciences became strained. Okay, so when everything is all good when you come into when you're on the same page, but once you get off the same page, things get a little different. You feel what I'm saying? So the things of the considered occult sciences were not always aligning up with where modern science was going, right? So, let's see. Okay. Referring to them as occult scientists carried the deliberate suggestion that they were unified. Well, let's go back. Hence, whereas seen merely from the outside, the domains of magic, astrology, Kabbalah, and alchemy might look like relatively distinct disciplines, as Hanegraaff comments. Referring to them as occult sciences carried the deliberate suggestion that they were unified at a deeper level, because they reflected one and the same comprehensive, hidden, but universal knowledge about the true nature of reality. Occultism thus emerged as a specialist field devoted to the excavation of knowledge about the underlying unity of the cosmos and the energies and agencies with which it was animated. Its aim was to access truths that had been hidden from the vulgar, but revealed to the wise as higher knowledge. So as the early modern period progressed, however, it was increasingly difficult for such notions to avoid conflict with the new ideas of the scientific revolution. And they go on to speak a little bit about Isaac Newton. And so there's an obvious connection between the Renaissance occultism and the emergence of new science. Now, practical interest, as we've already stated this here. So there was a strain that began to be placed on the occult because it wasn't lining up with how science was evolving at this time. So the occult, this is the important part, was slowly becoming a derogatory term used to indicate not profanity as such, but irrationality. So that's the sense of when you get somebody talking and they saying something related to the occult, they're irrational. They're crazy. They're delusional. We do the very same thing today. So whenever it's outside of that typical scope that we have that's acceptable, that really stems from Christianity, we really want to be real about it, because this is a Christian society, because Christianity is the last empirical hold on the world. It's Christianity. That is what it is. So if you're dealing in the occult, and anything that you're doing, if it was related to such, you were labeled as irrational. So it was a derogatory term. So imagine, let's say you something major, you might be a physicist, and some of your work is heavily embedded in the occult. That would mean that either you have to no longer be heavily dealing in the occult in the terms of what you're dealing with, so that it can be shown as an obvious tie to it, because if that's the case, you're gonna lose your validity in your field. Now let's look at Isaac Newton. Now Isaac Newton was a mathematician, amongst other things. He was a key figure in the philosophical revolution, the Enlightenment. He was not the first of the age of reason, but rather the last of the magicians, the last of the Babylonians and Sumerians, the last great mind which looked out on the visible and intellectual world with the same eyes as those who began to build our intellectual inheritance rather less than 10,000 years ago. And this was said by John Maynard Keynes. This is what he said. So he called him not the first of the age of reason, but the last of the magicians, because he is the last major known person that we know of that had actual theories and such embedded in the occult. That's what Isaac Newton was, and I'm going to show you some of that here. So let's go to the source and let's see what we can see. Okay, for example, while on the one hand, many early modern theorists such as Gottfried Leibniz and Isaac Newton failed to detach them, that both of them failed to detach themselves entirely from the influence of esoteric ideas. On the other hand, it is revealing that, for example, Leibniz dismissed Newton's theory of gravity as the reintroduction of the qualities occultae, which means it has occult qualities. which he insisted Rene Descartes had so successfully trounced. In other words, the occult was slowly, like I said, becoming a derogatory term used to indicate irrationality. Okay? So in the early modern scientific milieu, it mattered less that occult ideas transgress Christian constructs of the sacred and more that they transgress objective, rational, scientific thought. So in a climate in which ideas about nature were shifting towards increasingly secularized notions of a deterministic system governed by natural laws, a system in which observation, empirical evidence, and logic were paramount, any theories that seemed to rest on qualities occulte were dismissed. Okay? So that's when we see where he goes on to say what he says about Isaac Newton, being the last of the magicians. So although he was a major influence on the development of modern science, Newton spent at least 20 years studying hermetic materials, and over 2/3 of his writings discuss ideas relating to alchemy and to religion. So for Newton, physics and magic were generally understood to be part of the same natural philosophy. Okay? So that's what he believed. That's what he studied. So the times, however, were changing. As the modern period progressed, the idea that science might be rooted in magic was increasingly an uneasy one. So, as Randall Stiers notes, while in the 17th century there was no clear line of demarcation between occultism, philosophy, religion, and science, by the 18th century the situation had fundamentally changed in that natural magic was abandoned, and all forms of demonic and occult causation were effectively expelled from the natural world. Moreover, the natural and supernatural realms were clearly differentiated, and the role of the supernatural was severely constrained. So, this is evident, and this is, kind of clear point letting you know, as the modern era began to progress, there was not room for quote-unquote magic and for, religion and science, for all of that to be connected. They didn't want that at the time. So you have to think about what's going on historically at this time. Who's ruling at this time? Who is being dispelled at this time? All of these things are related. Okay? Alright, so, and we go on here to see more, let's see, the decline of the occult. So by the 18th century, natural magic was abandoned and all forms of demonic and occult causation were effectively expelled from the natural world. So you're looking at the 18th century. So the way that we perceive a lot about the occult today is just like the way it was perceived in the 18th century. Okay, so, and there's reasons for that. Okay, alright, so you can pretty much say that the occult is what's considered rejected knowledge. Okay, so the study of religion in academia has been dominated by Christian theology since the Middle Ages. Any objective analysis of that which the church suspected as pagan was culturally and theologically problematic. There emerged a popular perception of it as an unsafe, profane spiritual culture. Added to this, in some quarters during the 20th century, the occult became associated with far-right totalitarian discourses, which added to its reputation as irrational and dangerous. So peep game. So understanding peep game. Now, Christianity has dominated since the Middle Ages. So if it is outside of Christianity, if it's outside the church, suspected as pagan, then it is considered culturally and theologically problematic. Now, understand the power of the church at this time. You have what's called papal bulls, and we're going to get more into that. That's why if you study history and you know historically what was going on, and you can piece the rest of it with the occult, because it's pieces of it that's hidden in the occult, because that's been thrown out as well. everything that's been thrown out, you have to look at it and understand why it's not a part of the traditional realms of study, because there's a reason that it's not, right? So like we said, the occult is rejected knowledge. So let's see. Although there is little doubt that occult subjects were researched and taught in some early modern European universities, because the study of religion in academia had been dominated by Christian theology since the Middle Ages, any objective analysis of that which the church suspected as pagan was culturally and theologically problematic. This position was further exacerbated as the modern period progressed. When it was eventually abandoned as irrational, resistance to the occult hardened on both fronts, theological and scientific. So eventually, when they realized this is irrational to be this way, it was already a hardened thought in both in the church and when it comes to science. So as a result, during the 18th century, the study of the occult became the domain of the amateur enthusiasts. So this led to a final parting of the ways. The mainstream discourse of both science and theology othered the occult. As such, there emerged a popular perception of it as an unsafe, profane spiritual culture. Now, how many people are treated like this by their family because they burn sage? Or because you look at astrology, So added to this, in some quarters during the 20th century, the occult became associated with far-right totalitarian discourses, which added to its reputation as irrational and dangerous. For example, the influential Marxist philosopher Theodor Adorno was particularly concerned about the malign influence of the irrational in Western societies. Now, as a Jewish intellectual during the Second World War, he was understandably concerned about tendencies towards totalitarianism and barbarianism. Right? So he associated occultism with a regression towards barbarianism, and that it seemed to constitute resistance to reason, progress, and the whole Enlightenment project. The tendency to occultism is a symptom of the regression in the consciousness. Now, so what he was trying to say was, and he was trying to connect the occult to far right movements, making it appear dangerous, more so than it was. Now you have to look at it and understand, like I said, history is important. So why would it be connected to barbarianism? Who was barbarians? What was considered to be a barbarian? Right? They was like quote unquote pagans. Why? Because if I'm not going to let you come be no missionary to me so you can take my land, I'll be labeled a barbarian. If that what it is. You feel what I'm saying? Because 9 times out of 10, we going to kill you. We don't care about what you coming here with. You trying to take from us. That's just what it was. So, and when you look at the Nazis, right? And you look at the swastika and understand that that is a perverted ancient occult symbol. So now you have an occult symbol being affiliated with something that's quote unquote this negative movement centered around genocide. So that's another means to push the propaganda along that, hey, you don't want to be dealing with the occult. You don't want to be doing that. Those people are barbarians. Okay, they're unsafe. It's an unsafe place to be, or world to be dealing with. It's unsafe, profane spiritual culture. That's what they said about it.